Good morning, everybody. I hate to break up the 19 conversations that are happening simultaneously on one, but we have to get going because we are going to talk about one of the biggest concepts and everybody's favorite subject, which is love. And so we're going to be discussing love in a biblical pattern this morning, especially as it pertains to discipleship, and so we're going to be jumping around quite a bit. We're going to start, though, with John chapter 13. We'll start there in just a few minutes, so go ahead and jump over that. But before we begin, I'm going to ask Mr. Bradley Hall, if he doesn't mind, to lead us in a word of prayer.
Let us pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day. Thank you for giving us this opportunity because we come together and study another portion of thy word. Lord, we pray that Brother Brady will have great recollection of the things he has prepared for us, and we will take these things from your word and apply them to our everyday lives. Lord, we pray to be with all the teachers this hour, that your word will be spread and we'll have a greater learning of your word. Lord, please go with us now and forgive what we failed in. Jesus' name we pray.
Amen. Thank you. As you can tell from up on the board, we are rapidly approaching the end of this class. We discussed the different aspects of discipleship. This is one of the subjects that the world has kind of done and great disservice to. And so, as we look at discipleship, what we wanted to do during this class is kind of approach it more in a biblical standpoint and kind of address it from what the scriptures say. Everyone wants to talk about discipleship in today's world. That's kind of a catchword with denominationalism. So we want to look at more from a biblical perspective. So that's what we're doing. But we don't have that many classes left. Next week, as you can see up there, we're going to be discussing the idea of worship. And then probably my favorite subject in the entire class, the idea of anticipation. One of the things that I've said probably 1,000 times, and one of the things that I hate saying, and I especially hate it when Howard says it, is when people say things like, I hope I get to go to heaven. So we're going to discuss heaven from a confidence standpoint and why we should be confident as disciples. So that'll be my favorite class, not that I haven't enjoyed the other ones, as Cody robs me in just a second. His first week as an elder, and he's already on the I want to start by asking this, or talking about this. There's a story about Jerome. If you know anything about Jerome, he's kind of an early writer, has a lot of very kind of influential things about early church history. And he said, according to his understanding, according to church history, he said the Apostle John, when he was much, much later in life, of course we know him at least around 92 AD is when he's around. But right when he was later in life, he would walk into church assemblies and he would really only say one thing. He would really only say one thing, and that was, my dear children, or my little children, love one another. One of those things that he said every single time. He didn't have much strength to say much else. And it got to the point that he even used to have to be carried into the assembly. And the only thing he would say was, my dear children, love one another. And eventually, I guess some people got tired of hearing him say that, so they asked him, why do you say that? To which he responded with, because if you do this, it is enough. Does anybody agree with this statement? Who said yes? Okay, it's either you or Joyce. Okay, Rachel agrees with it. Who else has an opinion on this? Then if you love one another, it's enough.
What do you mean by love?
What do you mean by love?
That's
what I'm asking you. That's the whole point of this exercise. Do you agree with this statement? Before John and me get into bigger arguments.
In part, yes.
Okay, in part. What part do you agree with? Right, love does drive everything. Yeah, I agree with that. You said yes, you agree with it. Does anybody disagree with this statement?
It depends on what enough is.
Okay, John.
It's, you can love one another, but that's not what we should have. You still have to obey the commandments.
Right.
The second of which is to love one another.
Okay, so you would be firmly in the disagree camp, I think, if I'm reading you right. Because as you mentioned, it does have a lot to do with what these words actually mean. Because the entire world says if you love one another, that's enough. What does the world mean when they say that?
Be kind.
Be kind to one another. Yeah.
Politically correct. Not like we do.
Right. Whatever you do, don't offend anybody, because that's obviously what we as Christians are supposed to be doing. Right. The Bible does it. Right. Right. And that's where 1 Corinthians 13 pops up and says, if I do this but don't have this, it profits me nothing. If I do this but don't have love, it profits me nothing. So the idea of love in today's world is very different than what the biblical definition of love is. How does the Bible define love? Not just as being politically correct, and that's kind of a modern day usage of it. Kind of the feminization, for lack of a better phrase, or the romanticization of it.
Depends on which version of love you're talking about.
Okay, John, once again.
Phileo or agape.
How does the Bible define brotherly love? Let's say that. Yes, for our Greek scholar in the audience, we're going with phileo. How does the Bible define biblical brotherly love? Putting everyone else ahead of yourself. Right. The actual definition, kind of piggybacking off that, is to do what's in the best interest of the one you love. That's where obedience, that's where servitude kind of comes into. And I don't mean servitude in terms of the way that we would kind of understand it, where somebody puts their thumb down on it. But obedience, submission, all those things kind of come into play when we love one another. And so the idea that John is getting at here, and I think a very biblical definition, is if you do love one another, it is enough. And I agree with what John says, in the proper context. And that's what we're going to be discussing this morning. Look at John chapter 13, if you will. What happens in John chapter 13? This is one of those famous chapters, or at least one of the most famous events in Jesus' life. He washes disciples' feet, exactly. And when we look at John chapter 13, that's how we tend to isolate it. It's kind of the defining event that happens in this. From my opinion, though, if you look at John chapter 13, what you see is a progression of love, one from the end of the chapter. You see love defined very deliberately at the beginning, and you see it kind of progressing throughout the events of it. And you look at John chapter 13 and verse 1, it says, "Now before the feast of the Passover, Jesus, knowing that his hour had come, that he would depart out to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end." What detail does John include in John chapter 13 and verse 1? Because it kind of sets the stage. It's happening during the feast of the Passover. But what detail does John include in 13 and verse 1?
Love.
It's love. Yes. What does he say about love, though?
He loved his own to the end.
He loved his own who were in the end. Why does John throw that in there? Right, it absolutely sets the stage for what's happening. It sets the stage for what happens in John 13, but especially when you get to chapter 17, 18, 19, when you discuss the crucifixion, it sets the stage for that. But I think there's a contrast. When you look at verse 1 and then you kind of combat it with chapter 2, or you contrast it with verse 2, he says, "During supper, the devil already having put into the heart of Judas Iscariot, the son of Simon, to betray him." Then verse 3, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had gone forth from God and was going back to God, got up from supper, verse 4, laid aside his garments, and taking a towel, he girded himself. That's where you see the washing of the feet. That's where kind of verse 4 slips into verse 5, all the way down to verse 15. But what key details do the first 3 verses bring up in this chapter? What key details does it bring up? Number 1, that he loved him to the end. That's obviously the first one.
Even though he knew he was going to be betrayed, he still was a servant.
Right, he knew that he was going to be betrayed. You see that in verse 2. What else does he know?
Well, Jesus came from God, was going back.
Right, he knows that he came from God. He knows that he's going back there in verse 3. So you have him understanding not only what is happening at that moment, he understands who's in the room, he understands his whole purpose for being here. All 3 of those elements will manifest themselves throughout the course of John chapter 13, because when you look at verse 4, it says he got up from supper and he girded himself. He knows all these things in the first 3 verses. That leads into verse 5. In verse 5 it says he poured water in the basin and began to wash the disciples' feet, to wipe them with the towel with which he was girded. He then came to Simon Peter and he said to him, "Lord, do you wash my feet?" Jesus answered and said to him, what I do you do not realize now, but you will understand hereafter." Peter said to him, completely oblivious to the fact of what Jesus says, he says, "Never shall you wash my feet." He doubles down on his statement. Jesus answers him and says, "If I do not wash you, you have no part with me." Simon Peter said to him, "Lord, then wash not only my feet, but also my hands and my head." Jesus said to him, "He who is bathed needs only to wash his feet, but is completely clean, and you are clean, but not all of you." For he knew the one who was betraying him. There's that reference again in verse 11. For this reason he said, "Not all of you are clean." Verse 12, so when he had washed their feet, he took his garments and reclined at the table again. And he said to them, "You know what I have done to you. You call me teacher and Lord, and you're right, for so I am. If I then, the Lord and the teacher, wash your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I gave you an example that you should also do as I did to you." What does Jesus do in these verses?
He's commanding his disciples to be servants.
Right, he's commanding his disciples be servants. I was kind of thinking an easier question. Literally what he does is he washes the disciples' feet, but you're right. How does he epitomize this? He doesn't just say be servants. What does he do?
He does a lowly task.
He does a lowly task. Right, and not even, and this is kind of taking it a little bit deeper, this isn't just a slave task, this is a Gentile slave task. The Jews wouldn't even do this. If there were Jews and Gentile slaves in a Roman household, the Jews wouldn't even do this. They would relegate it to Gentiles because it was so important. Yeah.
The foot washing was not popular. It's not popular now.
Right.
Don't come over my house.
Well, I won't come over your house and offer to wash your feet. I'll come over your house and expect you to wash mine. But I'll be wearing shoes on the way over.
No, I've heard some people about enforce this, said we should do this today, but it's not true. In other words, today it would make people mad at you probably.
It might in some cultures. I've actually been to places in Africa, for instance, where they did wash your hands. And it was not your feet, but it was washing your hands. It was a very subservient type of task. And so that same kind of instance happens where you feel like it's an act of honor that somebody bestows upon you. And that's essentially what Jesus is doing in this passage when he's the one that's washing somebody else's feet. But in the background of all of this, whose feet is he washing? Not just the apostles, but whose feet is he washing? He's washing Judas's, thank you, Mother. Look at verse 31, or look at verse 21. In verse 21, what does it say? After he washes Jesus' feet, what does it say in verse 21? Right. He says that one of them is going to betray him, but it more importantly says that he's troubled in spirit. So think about the situation that's unfolding right before you. You have Jesus washing the disciples' feet. He knows all these things in the first few verses. And then it says that he's troubled in spirit. After this act, he's troubled in spirit. Why is it that he's troubled? It might say what happened. I think Jesus already knew. I think Jesus understood perfectly, yeah.
You know something's going to happen, and when you realize it's imminent,
Right.
that's when you're really worried, scared.
Yeah. I can see that. The immediacy of it, or the fact that it's imminent, may provoke some anxiety. I think you see that in the garden. I can get with that a little bit. What is the response? When Jesus says here in verse 21 that one of you is going to betray me, what's the response from the apostolic crowd? What's that? Well, not denial. Well, some of them deny it, but what is it that they ask? Which one is it exactly? They don't know who it is. Jesus knows who it is. Judas ends up getting the room. If you look in verse 28 through 29, it says, now no one of those reclining at the table knew for what purpose he had said this to them. So they're kind of completely oblivious to this. Verse 29, for some were supposing because Judas had the money box that Jesus was saying to him, buy the things we have need of for the feast, or else that he should maybe give something to the poor, which is kind of a random time to go just in the middle of the night and give something to the poor. So after receiving the morsel, he went out immediately, and it was night. Keep in mind that John is the one who, earlier in the book of John, would say that he was a thief because he had the money box, and he would oftentimes pilfer what was inside of it. But at this point, nobody knows what's happening. Judas leaves the scene in verses 28 and 29. Then in verse 31, therefore when he had gone out, Jesus said, now is the Son of Man glorified, and God is glorified in him. I think Jesus really ramps up the intensity, really ramps up the dialogue at this moment, and says, if God is glorified in him, God will also glorify him himself, and will glorify him immediately. Little children, I am with you a little while longer. You will seek me, and as I said to the Jews, now I also say to you, where I am going you cannot come. Verse 34, a new commandment I give to you, that you love one another, even as I have loved you, and that you also love one another. By this all men will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. Verses 34 and 35 are by far some of the most popular passages in this section, but Judas has already left, and what does Jesus do now? In verses 31 down through verse 35.
He mentions that he's going to be there for a short time, but things are in motion for him, for God and him to praise.
Right, I'm going to be here for a short time. There's going to be praise, there's going to be glory. And that's something that really John keys in on. If you look at John's gospel, if you look at the three epistles of John, his glory in the cross is something that John really kind of keys on throughout most of the dialogue. But what does he say in verses 34 through 35? What does he give them? Right, new commandment. Exactly. Is this a new commandment? To love one another.
The condition is that
Right. There's the condition, as I have loved you, which has a whole host of different issues. The book of, I think, Deuteronomy would talk about loving your brother. That's not the problem. It's not the idea that love is a new commandment. It's that condition that's placed on it. What is it about this that makes it a new commandment? When Jesus says, a new commandment I give to you, that you you love one another as I've loved you. What does that mean? What does that show? And keep in mind everything that's just happened in this chapter.
So willingness to honor, put others before yourself, and ultimately, as he's going to talk about later, to live in their life for each other.
Right, there's a difference in intensity. The idea that I would even sacrifice my life for something, up to and including that point. Yeah, I think that has a lot to do with it. What else does it imply? And keep in mind what had just happened. It's not just a what or how we love somebody else, but also a what. Right. Right, and love the person who is going to betray him. Exactly. And that's really what I was trying to hone in on. When you look at John chapter 13, 1 through 35, it's a discussion on love, and it's a discussion on the intensity of love, but it's also a discussion on who to love. And that's a delineation that Jesus makes on a number of occasions. If you look, for instance, in Matthew chapter 6, and he ends this whole, or Matthew chapter 5, he ends this whole dialogue about, you have heard that it was said, but I say to you. He then talks about love, and he talks about forgiveness, and he says you are to be perfect just as your heavenly Father is perfect. What does he say in that moment? Or what is he talking about when he says that? That you are to be perfect just as your heavenly Father is perfect. Does anybody remember? He says if you love those who what? Only love you, then what? I showed that back in, yeah. You're no better than the Gentiles, exactly. If you love only those who love you, then you're no better than the Gentiles. And he finishes that thought by saying, you are to be perfect just as your heavenly Father is perfect. When you flash back in this chapter, what we just read earlier in John chapter 13, there's that little instance, I can't remember exactly where he says. Yeah, in verse 7, where Jesus says to him, what I do you do not realize now, but you will understand hereafter. What is it that they didn't realize? Yeah, there's a lot of things they didn't realize, to be fair. You can see that throughout the course of this stuff. Right. Right. They didn't realize the sacrifice that was happening. They didn't realize the intensity of the love. They didn't realize what? Right.
You know, one of the soaked the shipwrecks and the stonings.
Right.
All the persecution.
Mhm.
Because of their love.
Right. It's because of the love not only for God that they would go through something like that, but also the love for the brethren. And that's why when you look at the end of 2 Corinthians chapter 11, I think that Dustin mentioned to us on Wednesday night, it's not just the stonings and the night and days, but at the very end, it's my concern for all the churches. That's very strategically placed at the end of that, isn't it?
You know, talk about love of Christ. Make me wonder if any of us really can speak as far as love. Because they said, you love your neighbor as yourself.
Yeah.
Do you love your neighbor as yourself?
Mhm.
I mean, would you do that properly?
Right. Well, I can't argue that Joyce has reached the peak of love throughout her life, so I'll just say that for right now. But no, I agree with you. The question that Howard brought up, which I think is an excellent question, is there ever a point where you can get to the peak of your love, where you can say, I love perfectly as God loved us? I don't think any of us ever could say that. I think there's always ways that we can do better. I think that's just us being honest with ourselves. I think even the apostles would probably say something like that. So the idea that love is boundless, that it's limitless, and it's not to be, and I've seen this used too often, it's not to be used as a weapon. Sometimes you hear people say, if you truly love me, you would do blank. It's never used offensively, and that's one thing that we really need to make apparent. You never hear Jesus saying, or you never hear the apostles saying, if you love me, you would do blank, and it's something that's personal to them, like you would give me your parking spot, you would give me the last piece of bread, or whatever it is. It's never used as a weapon, and sometimes it is in our life. So to get back to Joe's point, though, about the idea of love being important to discipleship, it's about what we're willing to do, not only for God, but also for other people. There are two things, in my opinion, that are important to discipleship. The first one is rules. The second one is love. You have to have rules. You have to have love. You have to have boundaries, but you also have to have this, not emotional, purely component of it, but you have to have some kind of emotional component. What happens when you take the rules out of discipleship, though? Because there are a lot lot of people in today's world that say, I love God, and especially as you look there in verse 35, by this all men will know that you are my disciples. But what happens when you take rules out of the situation, out of discipleship? What do you have? Yes?
You just said, a lot of people say, and that's as far as you get with a lot of people.
Right. Right.
There you have it.
Right. A lot of people say I have love, and then a mildly tough time shows up, and they just throw their hands up and they're gone. Yeah. Mhm. That's true. You have anarchy. You have people just kind of hanging out, more or less. You have a church and people just kind of getting together and whatever. What happens when you take out the love out of the situation? What kind of disciple do you have then? And this is why both of these are important to discipleship. You have Phariseeism for sure. And although it's probably not pure Phariseeism, because if you just hold to the rules that Jesus gave, that's great. But Phariseeism is when you start to find your own and make up your own. Yeah. What happens though when you take love out of the situation? What does discipleship become? It becomes selfish, yeah, to a certain extent.
Become judicial and isolationist.
Right, it becomes a checklist. It becomes read this book, follow, show up here at this point, do this, don't do that. That's where discipleship comes. Which one of these do you think we as Christians are better at? Okay. Joe is saying that we're better at both. What do we sometimes, as a group, what are sometimes we as Christians better at? As conservative Christians, right? We're better at keeping the rules, exactly. And both of these have to be important. There are lots of religious groups in the world that excel at the idea of love and have no rules. There's no direction. There's no kind of trajectory. It's just kind of people having good emotions and good thoughts about each other. It takes both of these to kind of come into action. Does anybody have any thoughts or comments about this before we keep going? Yes?
So maybe we're gonna get there eventually, maybe not.
Probably not.
So the definition of love, Corinthians 13, verses 4, it's more talking about the gifts of the Spirit, but it's also the marks of love.
Right.
It's love, long suffering. It's not puffed up. It's I don't know if you would include.
I wasn't.
Okay.
So go ahead, yeah.
Well, I mean, I can read the whole thing.
Yeah, go ahead if you want to.
Well, not the good of reading out.
Sorry, we'll just stare at you really awkwardly.
He talks about the charity, the marks are about love. It's long suffering, is kind, envieth not, availeth not itself, it's not puffed up, does not behave itself unseemingly, seeks not its own, and is not easily provoked, thinketh no evil, rejoiceth not in iniquity, but rejoiceth in truth, bearing all things, believing all things, hoping all things, enduring all things, never fails, but whether there's and then start talking about
Yeah. And that's important to bring up because all those definitions of love, and that's essentially what Paul does in 1 Corinthians 13. Love is blank. Love is blank. All those, at least most of them, are outward facing. All of them have to do with our relationship to other people, how we treat other people. It's never love, as you mentioned there earlier in 1 Corinthians 13. Love doesn't seek its own. Love isn't selfish. Love doesn't pursue what I want. And so when we talk about biblical love, that's the essence of it, the selflessness. And you see that in John chapter 13. You see that in Jesus's, as we'll talk about here in a little bit, Jesus' death on the cross. And so the question then becomes, how do we show our love to other people? And that's really kind of the question that we need to end with this morning. Not that the class is over right now, but that's where we will eventually get to. There's some truths, though, I think, about biblical love that we need to really kind of nail down. Look at 1 John chapter 3, because this is where, as we mentioned earlier, John really gets into biblical type of love. Look at 1 John chapter 3. 1 John chapter 3, and this actually goes great with what Kevin was talking about earlier. 1 John chapter 3 and verses 11 and 12. John writes, "For this is the message which you have heard from the beginning, that we should love one another. Not as Cain, who was of the evil one, and slew his brother. And for what reason did he slay him? Because his deeds were evil and his brothers were righteous." Who does John bring up in verses 11 and 12? Cain. I heard it like 5 times before finally George said it. Right. Why does he bring up Cain and Abel? What point is he trying to bring up? It's an example of what not to be, for sure. What was the problem with Cain? Well, I guess that's the obvious answer, is that he killed his brother. That's the big thing that he did wrong, yes. Okay, the idea is Garrett. What else is the problem with Cain? He was envious, exactly. When you look at verse 12, for what reason did he slay him? Because his deeds were evil and his brothers were righteous. John takes that little nugget, verses 11 and 12, extrapolates it in verses 13 down through verse 18. In verse 13 he says, don't be surprised, brethren, if the world hates you. He flips it. He puts us in kind of the mold of Abel. He puts the world in the mold of Cain. That's more or less the transition that he makes. In verse 14 he says, we know that we have passed out of death into life because we love the brethren. He who does not love abides in death. Everyone who hates his brother is a murderer, and you know that no murderer has eternal life abiding in him. We know love by this, that he laid down his life for us, and we also ought to lay down our lives for brethren. But whoever has the world's good and sees his brother in need and closes his heart against him, how does the love of God abide in him? Little children, let us not love with word or with tongue, but in deed and in truth. What aspect of love does Jesus or John bring up in 1 John chapter 3? Or how does he define love? By your actions, for sure. And what else does he define it as? How do your actions define it? Doing good for other people, for sure. Yeah. How else does he define love in this passage? By not what? By not killing your brother, yes. If we get nothing else out of this morning, I think we should really nail down that we should kill their brother. That's part of it. But look at how we kill each other, I guess, to just kind of go down this really dark train. In verse 15, everyone who what? Hates his brother is a murderer. Now, what does it mean when he says hate? Because this is a nice kind of companion to love, but it is kind of a nice little parallel to love when we talk about hate. How does he define hate in this passage? He is a murderer for sure. That's how we kill each other. This is taking a really awful turn. How does he define hate?
He can have any spirit of truth.
He doesn't have any spirit of truth for sure. Yeah. And that kind of goes into the Cain and Abel argument. Yeah. But how do we hate our brother according to that text? Look at verses 16 down to verse 18. It goes back to what Joe said a little earlier. Closing your heart to other people. Exactly. We tend not to think that closing our heart to other people is that really big of a deal. If we see somebody who's struggling, if we see somebody, and this isn't, by the way, just talking about physical, although when you look at 1 John 3, verses 17 through 18, that's absolutely the point he's trying to make. If you have this world's goods and you close your heart to other people, this can take on a purely spiritual context as well. If I look at my brother and see that he's in need of something, and I don't give it to him, what am I in essence becoming? What do I become when I close my heart to somebody else? Well, yeah, George has said murderer 3 times now. It's really awful. That's where George's mind is at. Yeah, did you have something? Cody?
I think what the rules and the love, they kind of go together. If you leave one without the other,
Right.
If you run into a situation where if your brother is struggling, whether it be, no matter what, if your brother's struggling, you don't do something for them, your soul's just as bad a danger as theirs.
Right, exactly. If you see your brother struggling and you don't do something, and once again, this goes back to the idea of not using it offensively. Somebody can't say, well, I'm broke and you need to give me $1 million. Well, that doesn't fly. But use it as somebody who opens their heart to somebody else. Then I'll say before God for that. Where do you see that in a huge way in Scripture, especially in the Gospels? Think about that. This idea of closing your heart to other people and that really affecting your soul. It's a very vague question, so I'll just leave that for 10 seconds. Where do we see that play out in Scripture?
You see that in Lazarus and the poor man.
Okay, you see that Lazarus, I wasn't thinking of that, but that's an excellent example. Lazarus and the poor man. Where else do you see that? Yeah, Lazarus and the rich man, I guess that. Yeah, see, you caught me off guard. Yeah, Zach. The Good Samaritan is another way to see that. Yeah. How? That's a little bit of a different story, but yeah, I can see where you're making that connection there. Let me ask you this: what happens at the end of Matthew chapter 25? Does anybody remember? 24 and 25 are these mega chapters. What happens at the end of Matthew 25?
Christ basically explaining why the justified are justified by
Right.
saying, you saw me in all of these situations where I had need and you supplied that.
Right. I put the sheep on the
Right.
sheep on the right, and the goats on the left. And then what's the delineation between the two? Now, this isn't the only delineation. It's not to say that all you have to do is open up your home, traveling pilgrim, and that's it. But what's the delineation that Jesus makes? sheep showed love. You saw me hungry and you did what? You fed me. You saw me thirsty and you what? You fed me, exactly. And that's where you see this kind of manifestation of love. And that's exactly what John gets into in this passage. In verses 13 and verse 18, if we just say that we love one another and there's nothing to back it up, then what is that love really? It's worthless, right? We become, as George has so eloquently stated, we become a murderer, right? When you look at James chapter 2, James makes the exact same point about faith. If we say we have faith and we don't have works, then what is it? Or faith is in vain, but our faith is also dead. In essence, we become a self-murderer. That's kind of the corollary drawn between those two passages. So when you look at these, when you look at love kind of in a nutshell, there's some things that I think you can make very plain about it. And the first and foremost one being that love begins with God. How do we know that love begins with God? What's that? Okay, because God is love. It's a good, easy answer. Interesting, but yes. How do we know that love begins with God? Look back to this passage. How do we know that love begins with God? Well, that's in James. Is that what you're talking about? Yeah, I'm actually still in 1 John chapter 3. But yeah, you're right. All good things come from Him. Look at 1 John chapter 3 and verse 16.
He's the one who proactively demonstrated it first.
Right, He's the one that demonstrated it first. God is the one that shows us what love is. He's the one that kind of originated what love is, which is a sharp disagreement with the way the world defines love. And that's what He's trying to get through this passage. We also know that it extends through us, that love comes to us, and because we realize that God has loved us, what do we then do in response? We show that love to each other, exactly. Here's a thought question. When you look at Acts chapter 2, after the big scene about them asking men and brethren, what shall we do? What's the very next thing you see the apostles or the disciples doing in Acts chapter 2? And it's mentioned at least a couple of times there in Acts chapter 2. Right, the very next thing, as you mentioned, the very next thing is adding to the church day by day those who are being saved. But then immediately after that, as Nathan said, what do you see right after that? Them doing what?
Sharing all things.
Sharing and having all things in common. Let me ask you this question. Is that ever a commandment? At any point in Acts chapter 2 and Peter's big monologue, did he ever say, by the way, you need to repent and be baptized and also sell your goods and give them to each other? No. Jeff says no. Then why did they just start doing this? That's true. Some of it was the time. Right. And you see that kind of manifest itself when you look 2 chapters later in Acts 4. You see Barnabas into the situation. It's kind of a hallmark of the early church. Why is it that these people start doing that?
And it was part of their repentance too, because they were living selfish lives. And they were repenting from those that happened life, then they had to start preaching to others.
Right. They're repenting from an old life that they were apostate from God, and maybe not all of them were. Maybe they were decent Jews. So maybe they just thought, this is a part of my repentance and now turning to Christ. But there has to be a link between that manifestation of the hospitality, the acts, and the love, and their conversion. So what's that link between the two? Why do they start doing this? What do they realize? They realize God's love. Exactly. That will be the answer 90% of the time. So we'll just kind of leave that for here on out. They realize God's love. When you look at, especially Peter's monologue in Acts chapter 2, what is he convicted of? He says, you what? You killed the Son of God. Exactly. Their response is, what are we going to do? Or Peter says, repent and be baptized. That's a part of that repentance. If you nail the Son of God to the cross, you're going to have remorse to that. And I think that's what you see encapsulated there in Acts chapter 2. Does anybody have any thoughts or comments? Our love for each other is a natural manifestation of the love that we see God have for us. Yes, sir.
One thing we see that it's always the motive behind why we do what we do.
Right.
Like Paul said in Corinthians, so I give my body to be burned, give all my goods to the poor,
Right.
nothing. So if what we're doing is not out of the proper motive,
Right.
true love for brother, then it's
Exactly. If what we do is not motivated by love, then it's just kind of hollow. I mean, the acts are there, but there's no emotion, there's no intimacy, there's no extension beyond maybe what we know they need, maybe what we think they need. There's no depth to our love, and that's something we'll kind of key on towards the end of this. When somebody isn't loving towards their fellow man, when somebody is selfless, they kind of close themselves in, they don't talk to anybody, they don't reach out to ask anybody else what they need, what does that show about their spiritual life? What does that show about my spiritual life? It's lacking in what? Okay, yes, it's lacking in love. What is it lacking in love? Maybe a little bit of trust. Yeah, I can see that too. What is it lacking in love? Well, maybe it's a fearful love. It could be a fearful life, right? I was thinking it's lacking in true understanding of God's love. And you see this in the parable of the unforgiving servant, where the master forgives this person an unforgivable debt, this huge debt, and yet what does that person end up doing? He won't go out and forgive the person who has a smaller debt. That reflects a lack of understanding of what you've been forgiven, what I've been forgiven, and a failure to extend that to other people. That's what that parable in a nutshell is about. And so when we look at this kind of, I'm not a math person, but I like to sometimes think of things in kind of spectrums, but it begins with God. That's the point left. It extends from Christian to Christian to Christian to Christian to the world, more or less. That's why when Jesus says in John chapter 13 that by this all men will know that you are my disciples, everyone's going to see this type of intense sacrificial love that extends beyond borders, and they'll say that there's something unique about these people. That's why when you look at actually 11th chapter verse 26, it says that the disciples were called Christians first at Antioch. There's something different about them, and we can associate what's different about them with Christ. The same qualities are manifest. Somebody have any thoughts or comments?
Something to be cautious of is the concept of plausible deniability too. That if you sit there and think, well, as long as I don't look at them or talk to them, as long as I don't go near them, then I can deny that it was my responsibility. And if there's ever a point at which communication between Christians is breaking down to the point where it's like, well, I guess I'm not going to ask, I'm not going to tell, so that way I don't have to worry about it, then you're already in the middle of the problem that we're discussing.
Yeah, which is what when you flash back to Matthew 25, their argument was, we didn't see you sick, we didn't see you hungry, we didn't see you thirsty, and Jesus said you missed the point. Because when you didn't do it to the least of these, you didn't do it to me also. You're missing that knowledge, either willful or unwillfully, you're missing what you should have seen. Right. That's a good point to bring up. Okay, I think there's a third one. I kind of flipped it on you a little bit. I don't think there's just two. I think there's a third one. The third one is that God has defined love. We've kind of hit around that to a certain extent, but look one chapter more. If you're in 1 John 3, look at 1 John chapter 4, because this is where John really goes in depth on what love is. It's not just this emotional, gooey feeling. There's something definite about it. And when you look at 1 John chapter 4, you kind of see this unpacked a little bit. 1 John chapter 4, starting verse 7, he says, "Beloved, let us love one another, for love is from God." So there you see that origination that we've referenced already. Everyone who loves is born of God and knows God. The one who does not love does not know God, for God is love. It sounds very circular, but it all makes sense if we slow down for a second, which I never do. Verse 9, "By this the love of God was manifested in us, that God has sent His only begotten Son into the world so that we might live through Him. And this is love, not that we love God, but that He loved us and sent His Son to be the propitiation for the sins." That's true love. Verse 11, "Beloved, if God so loved us, we all also love one another. No one has seen God at any time. If we love one another, God abides in us, and His love is perfected in us." What does he bring up about love here in 1 John 4, 7 through 12? What does he teach us about love in those verses? Right, the extent of love. Right, the extent of love, what God has for us, what we should have for Him, what we should have for other people. Right, what else does he teach us? And keep in mind this third point, that God has defined love. What does he teach us about this? Right, if we don't love, we don't know God. But we don't really know love unless what? Unless we know God, exactly. If we know God in His sacrifice, then we know love. If we don't know who God is, if we don't know His sacrifice, then we don't really have a true capacity of what love is. In a sense, God has taught us love. He is love, but God has taught us love by being the person that He is, or by being the being that He is, if that makes any sense. His very presence teaches us love by His actions throughout His history with mankind. His dealings with the Israelites, His act in creation, His giving of His Son, all those things are examples of His love. And so we don't know true love unless we look to who the originator of love is. I think that's more or less what he's saying there. Look at verse 15 as he continues on this discussion. Verse 15, whoever confesses that Jesus is the Son of God, God abides in him and he in God. We have come to know and have believed the love which God has for us. That God is love, and the one who abides in love abides in God, and God abides in him. By this, love is perfected with us, that we may have confidence in the day of judgment. That goes a little bit with the anticipation we'll talk about in a couple of weeks. Because as he is, so also are we in this world. There is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear. Because fear involves punishment, and the one who fears is not perfected in love. We love, verse 19, because he first loved us. If someone says, I love God and hates his brother, he's a liar. For the one who does not love his brother whom he has seen cannot love God whom he has not seen. This commandment, verse 21, we have from him, that the one who loves God should love his brother also. How do we know that we're perfected in love? And there's a whole bunch of layers, and John is known for kind of speaking like this, very circular, bringing it back on himself. But how do we know that love is perfected within us?
If we love one another.
If we have love for one another, right. And so what does that love create in us? We are in essence a picture of what on this earth. Father. We are a picture of God in this world. I was just going to stare at you for as long as it was necessary. Did somebody have something over here? Is that?
Instead of the image of God.
We are a picture of the image of God, exactly. Keep in mind in John, once again in John chapter 12, I think it is, I'm probably wrong. But one of the apostles says, show us the Father is enough for us. And what does Jesus come back to say? Or say back to that? If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. Not necessarily the miracles, although that's obvious, that's an obvious connotation. What does Jesus mean when he says that?
Say, whoever likes,
Right.
love,
If you've seen the love that I have, not just in the miracles, but especially the way that the miracles were done, healing people, having compassion on people and feeding them, the gift of himself on the cross. If you see who I am, you see in essence God. That extends to us. If people see us, who should they see? God, exactly. We are an image of God on this earth. We are Christians. That's the very nature of our definition. The way that that's seen is in our love for other people. Does that make any sense? Okay. Rather not for Karen. So Karen's good to go, the rest of us are too. These are some biblical truths about love. You can extend this just as long as you want to. We don't have the time much longer to do that. But the way in which we see God's love is manifested itself through the cross. That's the ultimate definition of love. Why is that the ultimate definition of love? Why is the cross the ultimate symbol or definition of love? Is everything. You can't give more than what Christ gave on the cross. And the pain is there, the humiliation is there, the glory and the honor that's gone is there. All those things are there. And so when you look at the cross, that's the perfect symbol of what love means. Love is bound up in sacrifice and accountability last week. So then the question becomes, as we extend to ourselves, what's going to be our symbol of love? How do we manifest our love to other people? How do we show love to other people? Maybe not by sacrificing ourselves on the cross, but how do we show love and show ourselves to be disciples of Christ? I want to look at one more passage. We're actually going to end a couple minutes earlier. But I want to look at Ephesians chapter 3. Ephesians, if you are not super familiar with the book, Ephesians is a book that in large part discusses the unifying of Jew and Gentile. That's one of the major things you see there in chapter 2. But it also talks about building up together, the cooperation, the love that we should have for one another. And in Ephesians chapter 3, starting in verse 14, you see this, in my opinion, just in a magnificent way. In Ephesians chapter 3, starting in verse 14, Paul writes, "For this reason I bow my knees before the Father, from whom every family in heaven and on earth are under, saying that he would grant you, according to the riches of his glory, to be strengthened with power through his Spirit in the inner man, so that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith, and that you, being rooted and grounded in love," and listen to this, verse 18, "may be able to comprehend with all the saints what is the breadth and the length and the height and the depth, and to know the love of Christ which surpasses knowledge, that you may be filled up to the fullness of God." What is Paul's prayer in Ephesians 3? For 14 through 19. What is his prayer? What is his prayer in Ephesians 3, 14 through 19? He says in verse 14, "For this reason I bow my knees is the love of Christ." And you should know the love of Christ. Exactly. Why is it important that you should know the love of Christ? Which is the breadth and the height and the depth, and all these things that we have a hard time understanding. Why is it important for us to know the love of Christ? Or comprehend it, right, so that we can emulate it? Because once we comprehend the love of Christ, what does that create within us? As disciples, what does it create?
Creates motivation to obey, creates motivation to repent, creates motivation to confess, to share with other people, to lay down our lives if that's what it takes.
Right.
It is everything for a Christian.
Right. It is the core of our obedience. It's the core of our love. It's the core of everything. And without that, there's nothing else that we can do. And you see this. Let's look at a few more verses. You see this as it transitions into chapter 4. In chapter 4, starting in verse 1, it says, "Therefore I, the prisoner of the Lord, implore you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling with which you have been called, with all humility and gentleness, with patience, showing tolerance for one another in love." There's that word again. "Being diligent to preserve the unity of the Spirit and the bond of peace." That unity of the Spirit is kind of this idea that he has the next few verses built off of. Verse 4, "There is one body, one Spirit, just as you are also called, one hope of your calling, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is over all and through all and in all." What his goal is in verses 1 through 6 is unity. What's the only way that we're going to experience that?
We're all speaking the same thing in love.
We're all speaking the same thing together in love, for sure. How else are we going to achieve that unity? Think about what we just talked about in chapter 3.
If you have a core love,
Right.
core faith, then you will be strong.
Right. If we believe, if we begin to comprehend the love that God has for us, then it'll make us realize that He comes first in everything. That it's not about me, that it's not about Joe, it's not certainly not about Brad, it's about us as a group. And you see that unity in chapter 4, 1 through 6. Nobody laughed at that, so I guess I will love this series. But you see that love being the centerpiece of unity. I think that's the key part. Somebody have any thoughts or comments on any of this? Love is a super nebulous idea to try to kind of formalize the love with discipleship. Yeah.
There was a guy that worked with Paris. He had just a little flag on his ship that said, "If you don't see God in it,
That's a good flag to have. It'll show, but it's a good flag to have. Yeah, I agree with that. All right, anybody else have any thoughts? That's actually excellent. Okay, if not, we will pick up next week.